welcome everybody for the investigator-initiated trials session today. I do have over 30 years experience in the drug and device industries, working in pharmaceutical, device, and CRO companies. And as a consultant to investigators, I'm currently operating a niche provider company by the name of the Freeman Group, and I do have the opportunity in this role to consult with investigators that are conducting investigator-initiated trials. This webinar is going to discuss the roles and responsibilities and the highlights that accompany the investigator who plays in this type of study, where he or she is both the investigator and the sponsor. Often the investigator fulfills their role as an investigator, but not that of the sponsor. This often involves the lack of adequate monitoring, which can lead to multiple regulatory deficiencies. This is paramount for the safety of the subject, which is the main emphasis, of course, of the regulatory governing body, which would be the FDA. We're going to present a typical process today for running an IIT study, and we'll discuss the role and responsibility of the investigator in these trials, highlighting the risk and providing suggestions for compliance. As we get started, you'll see you have a number of handouts at the top of the screen, and you've been emailed those as well. You don't need to open those up today, but they're great reference materials for you to look at afterwards, and we'll refer to them throughout the presentation. I'll flash them up as we go through, so you'll get a sense of which one is which. Today we're going to define what an investigator-initiated trial is, commonly known as an IIT. We'll review the applicable federal regulations for those types of studies, which will include the sponsor and the investigator responsibilities. We'll also review the steps that are involved in initiating one of those studies with a sponsor and review the regulatory reporting requirements. This is one of the biggest issues we have in these studies, the regulatory reporting pieces, because those are sponsor issues that most investigators have conducted grant studies with pharmaceutical or medical device companies, and the company did all that reporting for them. It's very unusual for an investigator in a clinical trial to speak with the FDA because the sponsor is taking over that role. On these studies, this investigator is the sponsor, so they would have that opportunity to do that, and that's where they usually fall apart. We'll identify some essential documents, in other words, the trial master file for the sponsor investigator. Again, they're not normally keeping the sponsor files. Using a DIA, Drug Information Association, Trial Master File Reference Model, which has been most accepted in the United States, to remain audit ready, because these studies can be audited by the FDA as well. We're going to minimize the risks associated with these type of studies by avoiding some of the common pitfalls. Where do most of the investigators fall apart in these? What do we learn from looking at FDA's warning letters when they've gone in and inspected an investigator for one of these types of trials? The key thing to remember here is that most of the same rules apply for the investigator-initiated trials as for the sponsor-initiated trials. In other words, there's really no light version, if you will, of sponsor responsibilities for IITs. They give a little bit of a break in terms of the documentation, realizing that this investigator is not a multi-million-dollar company like most of the pharmaceutical companies that they might be working with, but they still have to be looking for safety and the documentation there. These types of studies have grown immensely in recent years. Without a lot of blockbusters out there, the thought leaders are coming up with a great deal of ideas and passing them through major sponsors to get the permission to test this product. Most of them are not going to lead to NDAs, new drug applications, marketing, because the investigator is not in a position to handle that amount of work. Most of them might be pivotal studies eventually done by the major sponsor. We would call the IIT study more of a pilot study because it's typically a smaller scale. Let's test it in this population, for an example, and see if it will work. And then it might be sold back to the pharmaceutical company. It certainly would most often lead to a publication or a consortium type of study. We're going to look at lots of issues that these will raise as we move along. First of all, let's look at a definition. We're going to talk about drug and device studies today because they're very similar for these kinds of studies. The regulatory authorities define a sponsor investigator as an individual. It could be an organization or an institution that assumes the responsibility for initiating the study, for conducting the study, for managing the study, and or for financial support of a clinical investigation.